Well, here's another nice mess you've gotten me into.
Well, that was the great Oliver Hardy, because today marks the 50th anniversary of the death of Stan Laurel, part of one of the greatest comedy duos of all time, Laurel and Hardy. My next guest believes that their influence on modern-day comedy has in fact been underestimated. He's a lecturer in University College Dublin, and he's currently working about a book about Laurel and Hardy. Barry Brophy, welcome to the programme.
Thanks, George.
Lecturer in film studies? Or?
No, I'm a lecturer in engineering / communications, so I talk to people about communications. That's
right. Now, this is radio, of course, so they don't realise how young you are. Okay. And Stan died 50 years ago, so you actually won't have remembered them when they were alive and well and one of the great comedy duos of the world, presumably.
Yeah, well, I mean, I grew up with Laurel and Hardy, same as so many generations. Like, early 80s, I saw them on television. And amazingly, because we had colour television in the early 80s and computer games, but I mean, I just took to them, and even my small kids now are fascinated by them.
In black and white.
In black and white, yeah.
Now, the interesting thing about this couple, before we get to their act, in fact, if you go to the Royal Marine Hotel in Dún Laoghaire, there are pictures of them on the wall, because when they came to Dublin, they actually stayed in the Royal Marine.
Yes.
And now, the thing about this pair, of course, is that Stan was very small and slight, and Ollie was a great big sort of fat guy, but Ollie really only wanted to play golf. Movie making kind of interfered with his golf. Stan was the real technician, wasn't he? He was the guy who stayed in the editing suite and made the movie, really.
Yeah, Stan lived the films. I mean, this was his whole life, was acting, editing, directing, just being involved in the process. It was like a cottage industry at the Hal Roach Studios. They didn't just do these things by numbers. They didn't just hand the stuff over to the editor to finish. They all worked together in the meetings, from the scripting right through to the finished product. They even edited the films. They brought them to preview them in movie theatres and counted the laughs and measured the laughs and recalibrated and even reshot some of the films.
Wow.
Because the laughter, obviously, in a big room full of people is different to in a small studio. So they made the films with great love and great attention.
Now, Stan was British, of course, had emigrated to America, and he was the sort of technological and innovative power behind the pairing. What do you think we've learned in modern day comedy from them then? Why have they influenced so many extraordinary people? Like, I mean, our own Ardal O'Hanlon, for instance, you know,
huge fan,
Galton and Simpson, who wrote wonderful sitcoms for the BBC. What did they learn, in your view, from them?
Well, I interviewed Ardal O'Hanlon a few years ago, and he said something very interesting. He said when he played Dougal, he took it very seriously, which sounds like a contradiction in terms. Dougal is the simplest and silliest character in sitcom. But he said he played the character like as if he was the character. And this is the essence of sitcom, is that you believe in the situation. The actors and the characters believe in the situation, even though when looked at from the outside, it's quite silly. So in other words, you very often have straight actors playing important roles in sitcom. In the early days, they used to get comedians on television trying to be funny. But Galton and Simpson realised that, say, opposite to Hancock, you needed authenticity. You needed situations that seemed like real situations to make Hancock's absurdity seem so funny.
I mean, that's really interesting about Galton and Simpson, because, in fact, Steptoe and Son, the son whose name escapes me now, the actor...
Harry H. Corbett,
was a Shakespearean actor.
Yeah.
And went from Shakespeare to Steptoe and Son.
Exactly. Well, the funny thing about that was they didn't want to make another. They'd done Hancock for years. They didn't want to get sucked into another long-running sitcom. They'd made these things called the Comedy Playhouse, one-offs. And Steptoe and Son, the offer was a one-off. And it was quite tragic. And they said they were being plagued by the BBC. And they said, look, we'll do it if the two lads agreed to do it, thinking they wouldn't. Wilfred Bramble and Harry H. Corbett. It was like when you say to someone, I can't go, I don't have a car. And they say, I'll give you a lift. You know, they kind of cornered themselves in a way. And the two lads agreed to do it. And Steptoe and Son was born. But they were straight actors.
Now, astonishingly, Bruce Forsyth used a technique that he learned from Laurel and Hardy. What was that?
Just looking at the camera, bringing the camera in. I mean, it sounds like an easy thing to do, but it's incredibly difficult to do because there's a subtlety to breaking that fourth wall. So it's just, he had what he called a slave camera. So that when he was doing shows like Play Your Cards Right in the Generation Game, and at times when there weren't as many cameras on the go as there are now, there would be one camera on him, and he always knew that if he could give that little glance, that camera would bring the audience. What you're doing is you're bringing the audience in. The audience from home, the audience in the studio.
And Laurel and Hardy did this.
Oliver Hardy was, you grow up with it and you accept it, but he glances at the camera as if to say, this is absurd, or I can't believe that's just happened. And that's very rare in films, and it's actually breaking the rule I just suggested about the authenticity of the situation. But of course, The Office is another example, where the characters, because
Ricky Gervais,
where the characters are playing in a sort of a faux documentary so that they can look at the camera. And this is exactly, and they used to say to Martin Freeman, give us an ollie, when they wanted him just to glance, turn his eyes, flick them to the camera and look back at the action.
Now, my guest is Barry Brophy, who's a lecturer in communications in University College Dublin, but currently working on a book about one of the great comedy duos of the early days of film, Laurel and Hardy. If you remember Oliver, the big fat guy, and he always got in trouble because Stan dropped him in it. He used to play this thing with his tie. Right. Do you remember? He used to fold his tie up and down. And the clip we opened with, this is another fine mess you've got me in. The essence of comedy, there's always sort of a good guy and a bad guy, isn't there, in a way? There's always a victim, I suppose.
A battle, exactly, yeah. He is the victim, yeah. But, I mean, that thing you say about the tie, there was a great subtlety to Oliver Hardy. He was a big man, but he was very light on his feet. He looked graceful. And the great good fortune with Laurel and Hardy was when sound came in, his voice had a gracefulness about it, a high tenor, sonorous voice. Whereas Stan, who's small and slight, has a bass voice, and almost an echoless, almost accentless kind of voice. Stan actually took the heels off his shoes so that he was sort of back on his heels, so he looked like a sack of sand. He had a heaviness about him. Even though he's the smaller man, he looked slower, and this played into their voices when sound, so they actually were already well established in silent movies, and then when sound came in, it just made them extra, it just made them better.
And, it's interesting you mention Ardal O'Hanlon, for instance. It's really interesting that, do you believe that modern day comedians, as they formulate a technique or a style or an identity, that they look at Laurel and Hardy or Abbott and Costello or,
Well, I know that Ricky Gervais and Stephen Merchant, when they were doing extras, they said, let's do a Laurel and Hardy setup. One of them is a woman. And actually, as Stephen Merchant pointed out to me when I talked to him, it's all Laurel and Hardys, like Sean Williamson, who's Barry from EastEnders, and Stephen Merchant play a Laurel and Hardy. A stupid person who doesn't realise, he thinks he's smarter than the other guy, and the other guy looks up to. But Ardal O'Hanlon said to me, he didn't consciously say, I'm going to invent a Stan. But when he looked back, he realised he had taken so much. I mean, he said he was nearly embarrassed at how much he had almost been the grandfather, as he referred to him, of sidekick Stan Laurel.
He sort of was about to plagiarise again.
Almost.
Yeah. I must say, I will look at Father Ted with a whole new vision now.
Father Ted is a brilliant example of the classic British sitcom where the main character thinks he's smarter than he actually is and is constantly undone. And he is the sidekick as well. And it's this beautiful sort of steptoe and son scenario, Hancock scenario, Laurel and Hardy scenario.
But you also mentioned Fawlty Towers, for instance, or Captain Mannering in Dad's Army. Captain Mannering, a sort of an Oliver Hardy character?
Absolutely,
in terms of physical resemblance?
No, just in terms of he believes he's more important than he is, and he believes he's smarter than he is. And it's this kind of delusion that constantly undoes him. Fawlty's the same. And he thinks that he belongs in a better world. That's the way Stephen Merchant put it. And he's constantly pegged back because of this. Alan Partridge is the same. David Brent is the same. So there's a lot of those Oliver Hardy types.
We see less of it, of course, on television today, which is a shame because you talk about your children.
Yeah.
Children understand that kind of comedy so well on a different level. They may not see it in a sort of intellectual
social
way
level,
that you and I might, but they get the comedy, don't they?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I mean, I was reflecting on this. I used to watch the young ones when I was about 11 or 12, and also Steptoe and Son and Only Fools and Horses. But great comedy does a rhythm and a reality to it that makes you laugh, even if you don't get all of the jokes. There's something in it. And Laurel and Hardy had that primitive reality to it.
It's the 50th anniversary of the death of Stan Laurel. Oliver went first, didn't he?
He died in 57.
Heart attack on the golf course or something like that?
No, just general failing health. He was big, and that did catch up with him as well, but no, it's just failing health and stroke eventually.
And Stan, just old age?
Yeah, he had a heart attack and died 4 days later.
Did they make a lot of money?
They didn't do brilliantly, but they didn't do badly. Stan was comfortable. He lived in a modest apartment in Santa Monica, but he was never interested in money, so he was happy enough that way.
All right, but they didn't die in penury?
No, that's a bit of a myth. No, they didn't. But I mean, they were largely forgotten by the American audience. They were much, much more popular in the British Isles and Northern Europe. And when they came over here, I mean, it was like Beatlemania. They were mobbed. So in the States, their films were butchered a little bit for television purposes.
All right, well, also, if you go to Newstalk.com, we've got an article on deathbed words of great comedians, which in a macabre way you might find humorous, but especially my guest, Barry Brophy of Lecturer in Communications, University College Dublin. Can't wait for the book. I've just started a book about Tennessee Williams, right, and that's the most depressing thing I ever read. So I can't wait for Laurel and Hardy and Barry Brophy. Speaking of books, guest on Thursday, Jeffrey Archer's popping in, and we'll be talking about his latest book.